Hello and welcome back to Book and Page. So we are starting in on Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Now, my particular translation is by James Winnie, so you might have other translations. Just be aware of that. It will change the wording that's being used and how close it is translated from the Middle English. My suggestion, if you can get a facing translation like this, go for it. Because it's really useful to have the Middle English there. You could actually start adjusting, seeing similar things, seeing words that you actually recognize. And even better, if you can get somebody that speaks and reads the Middle English, bring them along for the ride. So, for the book and page videos for Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, there are 4 parts to this book, but because it's sort of long for a single video each, I'm breaking them apart. The first, second, and fourth parts of the book I'll be breaking up in roughly about half, so there'll be 2 videos for each of those parts. And then the third part I'll be breaking up into 3 videos. If you've read the book before, you'll understand why I do that. If not, you'll understand when we get there. So that overall counts to 9 videos for Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So, let's get started. As always, I'll start with a summary of what happened in this first part of part 1, and then we'll get to some talking points. So, our story begins with a bit of historical flair, telling us about the fall of Troy and the founding of Rome, and how Rome led to Britain. Then we actually get sort of an introduction to the author, who tells us that this is a story that he heard about King Arthur, the noblest of the British kings, and he's decided he's going to tell us this lovely story, which is very nice. And then we get into the story itself. We start our story being told that Arthur spent Christmas at Camelot. And of course everyone knows Camelot. It's the big sort of recognizable place that Arthur has his court. And Christmas is an easy celebration everyone recognizes. In fact, Arthur enjoyed Christmas so much he celebrated it for 15 days. And they had a lot of parties, a lot of feasts, a lot of games. It was nice. It is now New Year's Day. So, bit of an odd jump there, but we are now at New Year's Day, and we're having a feast. Guinevere and the knights are all settled down, ready to eat, and we do sort of meet a couple in this first introduction. But Arthur is not joining them, because Arthur has a bit of an odd habit. When it's big feasts like this, he doesn't like starting to eat until he's been told about a weird happening, or sees a weird happening, or fights somebody. Arthur, you strange man. So, turns out something's about to happen. Ain't that always the case? And the something happening is a gentleman bursting in on the scene he's a big man, he's riding a horse, he's got a gigantic axe, and all of this stuff is bright emerald green. Okay, wasn't quite sure that that title was going to be a literal title, but yes, in fact, our Green Knight is green. So we sort of end this part with the Green Knight bursting in. We get a nice long description of him, and then he asks where the head of this court is, which of course is King Arthur. So all of the court sort of stand there quietly, looking at King Arthur, waiting for him to speak. So, that's a bit of a beginning. Now before we get into the text itself, I want to speak about an academic question that a lot of students often ask themselves, which is to read or not to read the introduction. Now, I will say a couple of things. The introduction, of course, is often a very good place to get some information about the text. In this case, comments by the translator about how they've translated the text. Oftentimes by the author, or somebody who knows the author, about the themes, things like that. So, it's good information to have, and oftentimes professors in classes will expect you to have read the introduction and have that information. But it can be a disadvantage because oftentimes if it is a narrative text like this one, the introduction will spoil the narrative, which isn't always super fun when you want to just enjoy the story. So, truth be told, if you are reading for an academic purpose, for a class or something like that, my honest suggestion is either read it twice. Something like this is short enough that might not be the worst thing in the world. Read it and then read the introduction, or just basically make sure you are reading the introduction. Like I said, some professors will assume that you have the information from it, but a lot of times things like the introduction here is very helpful. It gives you a sense of what you're actually looking at, especially since it is a translation. So the translator here, James Winnie, is very helpful in explaining sort of the poetic form you're seeing, the use of language here, and he helps explain that this is a poem that combines Middle English, Old French, and Old Norse for different reasons, and that's not something you're necessarily going to pick up in a modern translation. So introductions are very helpful. You just have to keep in mind that you might be spoiled. But for a class, it's probably going to be better if you do read the introduction. So it is something of a note to say that keep in mind when you have something like this where it is done in verse, but then has to be translated, you're going to have some changes. It is very difficult to translate the style, which is this stanza with the bob and wheel at the end, along with the literal translation of the words and actions occurring. Those two, it's a very fine line to walk, if not impossible. So like I said, the introduction helps explain that. It helps explain why the rhythm and rhyme isn't always there, why the alliteration isn't always there, because you are reading a translated text. The other thing that James Winnie points out is that this is actually a story that's meant to be heard. A lot like the Greek tragedies that we just went through, which are meant to be acted and on stage and seen, this is actually a poem that really relies on being spoken aloud. And this is sort of set up in this very first part when the author introduces himself and says he's going to tell us a story that he had heard. And while it's written down, it really is something that works well to be heard out loud, because you do have that alliteration, that use of different languages for different meanings to characterize different characters, different actions, and things like that, which is often lost when you are reading, and especially when you are reading a modern English translation. So like I mentioned before, if you can get somebody who can read and speak the Middle English, they're going to be a fantastic asset when going through this book, because they will be able to pick out things that are different, because again, that translation's there. They're going to be able to pick out points of alliteration, different languages, because if they're trained in Middle English, they're more likely to be like, I'm not sure this is really Middle English, perhaps. Like James Winnie points out, there's Old French in here, there's Old Norse, so it's going to be useful if you could have somebody speak it aloud. And if truth be told, I would encourage you to read some of it aloud even in the modern translation, because you are trying to get the sense of rhythm of a spoken aloud story. So it's going to help if you try and put yourself into that. Just like I would say, act any play out as much as you can. Read some of this out loud, even in the modern English. It will be helpful. So let's get to the actual text itself, the actual section that we just went through. Again, read the introduction. It helps. Try and read some Middle English. Try and read even the modern English out loud, because you'll start picking things up. Like this weird sort of introduction that we start with, where we get into the actual text, but we don't immediately start with Arthur. We actually start, oddly enough, with the fall of Troy, which our writer seems to think he's definitely on the side of Troy over the side of the Greeks on that one, calling it treachery and yeah. So we start with this odd moment where we're thinking we're getting this story about one of Sir Arthur's knights, Sir Gawain, and we start in a completely different time period in a completely different country. But very rapidly we somehow end up in Britain, and that's because we go through this sort of immediate cycle of kingdoms. Troy falls and is then reborn into Rome. And then Rome comes and founds the British, at least the Roman Britain, and we suddenly have this cycle of kingdoms that starts our poem off. And from there, we suddenly have to be aware of why our author is starting us here. Because it is a very weird place to start with. I mean, you really could just start with Arthur was celebrating Christmas at Camelot. That's an easy place for this author to start, but instead he gives us these 2 stanzas of this cycle into Arthur, starting at Troy. So we are actually seeing the fact that this author is well aware that this is a minor story in a much, much, much bigger tale. Not even just within Arthur's kingdom, but within the history of kingdoms itself and the history of the world. But starting with the fall of Troy reminds us starkly that we are seeing, while the beginning of it we are in a cycle that is going to result with the fall of Arthur and his kingdom. We know that because Troy fell, reincarnated into Rome. Rome fell. We have some reincarnation into Arthur's Britain. But if any of us know history, and any of us know Arthurian legends, Arthur will fall, and there will be several more groups that actually come into Britain until the point that it actually develops into the British Empire it becomes. The Normans, the Anglos, the Saxons. And yes, those are 2 different groups. Suddenly, we've got this Roman Britain here that is going to be reforged several more times before we hit even semi-modern points and further into what we have today. And the author, again, is starkly aware of this. Now, he is, of course, looking back on myths and legends and history way back when. He's not saying Arthur's still alive and this is happening currently. He knows the story, he knows the swing to the kingdom that's actually happening. And he's drawing our attention to it. But he does so in a really interesting way, because what he allows then is this swing to the kingdom that can still have bright moments. Because there are several points in introducing Arthur and his court that he specifies that this is the beginning of Arthur's kingdom. We're not so far in the cycle for Arthur that everything is starting to look blue. In fact, these people are at the top at the moment. We get things like, for these fair people, we're in the flower of youth. And on Arthur, he describes several times, was so lively in his youth and a little boyish. And he describes Arthur's blood as young blood. So we're suddenly getting this sense that while we need to recognize this cycle is occurring and recognize Arthur's place in it, we're allowed for a moment, all of us are allowed for a moment, to be in that bloom of youth, to have young blood, to be a little boyish, and have these shining moments that mean something. Now, the court might be a little overindulgent. They're having double servings today on New Year's, and they're playing some very nice kissing games among the court. Guinevere is flourishing, as are the knights, though it can be noted, of course, that Lancelot is not named here. But we're having this moment of truly meaningful celebration and camaraderie among this court. So, while this kingdom cycle is occurring, we don't always have to feel down about it. We don't have to be so stuck in the cycle that we can't celebrate when we are still young. So it's this lovely moment where we get this cycle at the very beginning that speaks about destruction, knowing full well that Arthur's kingdom will fall. And then the author brings us into this beautiful celebration of youth. And we're almost tricked into it. Because we're expecting Arthur at sort of the end of everything. The fall of Troy, the fall of Rome. We're running into the idea that we're going to hit the fall of Arthur. And the author says, no, let's instead have a story about Arthur's court in its youth. When there were many possibilities. When the enemy of the court was not in the court itself. And that is when the enemy from outside the court comes in. We suddenly have this green figure enter the scene, this green knight, and he is described very in-depthly. We actually get 5 stanzas describing this knight, what he's wearing, his horse, how he's acting, and his first words. 5 stanzas. Arthur and his court get 4 if you don't include those first 2 about the cycle of kingdoms. This knight gets 5. And it's some lovely description that really helps to characterize this person in comparison to the court. This is a person of extremes. Extreme height, extreme girth to the shoulders, extreme weapon size, and again, bright green. But he's also characterized differently. He's not wearing proper armor. He's not even wearing proper shoes. But he's still come in to this place and sort of busted in like the party crasher that he is. And everything stops. And we stop too, because we're suddenly starkly reminded of that kingdom cycle. Is this sort of that downfall entering into the court? Should we suddenly be concerned that this is how everything is going to fall apart? Well, interestingly enough, no. If you actually look at how the Green Knight enters, he comes in the middle of a stanza. He doesn't start at the beginning of a stanza, nor does he appear in sort of the bob and wheel at the end of one. He enters in the middle, which is reflective certainly of the party crashing nature to him, but it also speaks of where this tale actually is in the story. We are not at the terrifying point where everything is going wrong. We're at the early history of Arthur. We're in the middle of the story. And we can have these fantastic moments that provide character growth that don't have to be so terrifying there's nothing we can do about it. And that's another interesting thing about the last stanza that we actually get when the Green Knight speaks, before Arthur speaks. So for long there was only staring at the man, for everyone marveled what it could mean, that a knight and a horse might take such a color, and become green as grass, and greener it seemed, than all green enamel shining brightly on gold. All those standing there gazed, and warily crept closer, bursting with wonder to see what he would do. For many marvels they had known, but such a one never. So the folk there judged it phantasm or magic. For this reason many noble knights feared to answer, and stunned by his words they sat there stock still, while dead silence spread through the rich hall, and so everyone fell asleep, so their talk stilled at a word. Not just for fear, I think, but some for courtesy, letting him who all revere to that man reply. So we suddenly get this sense that this is mystifying. It's new to the court, just like the court is new. But not completely new. They've had moments of strangeness. We're coming into the middle of the story, and we're going to see what happens from here. Now there is a little fear, but there's also trust that King Arthur, the man they all revere, will be able to respond appropriately. This isn't a kingdom that's lost its faith and starting to splinter. This is a newer kingdom that trusts in Arthur and his knights. So even when a strange border figure like the knight enters, they trust that things will work out. None of them are immediately attacking this man. They're waiting to see what happens. And we're also sort of holding our breath with them. This is a fantastic way to start a story, because we are given the sense of a grander story here, and then being told, okay, but we're going to talk about a smaller one. And then from there, we're given something very normal, this celebration of Christmas at King Arthur's court, and into New Year's. And then we're given something that's not normal. This big green man comes in and wants to know where the king is. You want to keep reading, don't you? You want to not only understand who this person is, but you want to understand how Gawain is important to this. How this story fits into Arthur's kingdom as a whole. Are we going to see the downfall coming? Or are we allowed to exist in this bloom of youth and just enjoy a story? Can we still grow in this bloom of youth without fearing the downfall? It's a bit fun. It's a bit frightening. But there's wonder there too. And awe. And maybe it's worth waiting to see what this large green knight has to say. Maybe we're all allowed to be young and make some mistakes. Gawain certainly is. I think we're going to learn a lot from Gawain while we enjoy his story. So I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.